In 1998, Universal decided it would embark on the journey to remake Psycho. For those uninitiated, Psycho isn't a movie you should watch because it'll change your life. It won't. It won't even change your perspective of horror. Because Psycho changed horror. When that projector hit that silver screen, the formula for terror was forever changed. And the variables were invented by Hitchcock. But back to Universal in 1998. How do you remake something that broke the mold? Personally, I find the most important element in any remake or reinterpretation of a text is the feeling. Did this movie convey the same feelings as that original film? No, it didn't. The director Lars von Sant claimed that this movie was an experiment. An experiment to see if a shot-for-shot remake could repeat a box office. He failed. He made a series of choices, from the way certain characters were portrayed to simply shooting it in colour. Psycho could have been shot in colour. Hitchcock chose black and white. Lars von Sant failed. This was not a shot-for-shot remake. It's close. I'm not denying it's close. But those choices show a misunderstanding of that original film. And if you don't understand something, how can you possibly hope to recreate it? That's why the 1998 remake of Psycho failed. Because it didn't understand how to feel. And if something doesn't understand how to feel, how can it convey those feelings onto you? So, Last of Us Part 2, according to the internet, was a controversial game, which, fun fact, is just secret internet code for it sucked. But like, why? Part 1 was a monolith of a game that elevated the genre as a whole, so how could things turn so quickly? Theme. I would argue it was theme, which, by the way, I found super interesting to look at, so that's why we're here. And yes, for those at home, foaming at the mouth, waiting for me to go on an inevitable, massive critical rant about this game's failure, don't worry. It's coming. But before we begin to digest the inconsistent storytelling of Part 2, let's stop and go back and purposely narrate why Part 1 worked so well. But first, obviously. So I would argue that the theme for Last of Us Part 1 is letting go and moving forward. Joel is essentially a man that tragedy befell and never left. He is a man who allowed his bitterness to not only rot his perspective of the world, but his attitude towards it. Playing through his eyes not only allows us to view the world through his pessimistic but realistic nature.
Well, what about the guy?
He ain't even hurt.
But grow attached to the same things as him. Hold on to that same hope that's growing in his heart. I've always viewed the ending as Joel deciding to move forward with his life with Ellie instead of just falling back into his own aggravated despair. Saving Ellie also means stopping any real chance of there being a cure. So whilst it isn't necessarily the right choice, it is an understandable one
to say the least. The Fireflies, the group who want to use Ellie to make a cure, reflect the main theme as well. Their perspective is that everything that is wrong with society's current state stems from the infection, which honestly isn't exactly right. The infection is responsible for causing the initial panic and disorganization of society, but the infection doesn't have an agenda. Okay, so just imagine it like this. Say 500 lions escape from the zoo. That would be a perfectly reasonable excuse to panic, and yeah, there would be some disorganization on that day. But you wouldn't blame the lions for people running around, attacking and robbing each other. Last of Us takes place 20 years after that initial infection. Sure, curing it will make life easier, but it's not gonna rewind the clock. It's not gonna change people, because people chose this. Please don't. This is obviously opposed against Tommy's group, who aren't uninterested in making a cure, but rather making life better in general, on moving forward. I don't think it's insane that Joel and Ellie end up with Tommy's group. I think it's just nailing the moral into the coffin. Every story point, every group, every character reflects this theme one way or another. And to be honest, as far as stories go, this game was masterfully crafted. But now let's take that same lens and put it onto part 2. What was the theme of this game? Honestly, I've had a really hard time figuring that out. And by the looks of it, I wasn't the only one. Now, I'm not actually going to go into great detail about this yet, but I wanted you to start thinking about it. What is the theme of Last of Us Part 2? It's not revenge. I know it's very instinctual to say that this game is in fact about revenge, but that doesn't make sense for Abby's story. But, once again, I'm getting ahead of myself.
Why are we still here? Just to suffer every night.
Wine's so good. Like most games, the beginning works in isolation. It establishes where Joel and Ellie are at in their lives and how they've integrated into the community. But what it does in an absolutely terrific fashion is establish the villain. This will be a problem later. The introduction of Abby as a villain is honestly amazing. We're first shown a choice. She didn't have to do this. In fact, she's going against the grain for this goal. This decision was her choice. Then we're given a reason for her to not. A pretty good justification that would allow most people to go back on their previous convictions, but not her. We didn't see forgiveness, not even a moral hesitation. We saw rage. A rage consuming a character, binding them to an act of violence we can't help but to detest. Honestly, it's great. I hated her. Didn't you guys? Which brings us to Ellie. Fueled by that rage, Ellie commits to the task of hunting down each of the perpetrators and burning that rage through them. It shows us the gritty, messy nature of revenge and the consequences left in your wake and on your soul. Or at least it should have. The biggest issue with Ellie's side of the story is a lack of commitment. Ellie doesn't unjustifiably murder anyone of the perpetrators. Every time Ellie comes across one of them, either they attack her or there's some pretty hard leaning done to justify the murder.
Yeah, that little bitch got what he deserved.
It just takes away from this being a whole destruction left in Ellie's wake thing by muddying the water so much. You could strongly argue
that Ellie didn't actually want to kill these two. You could even mildly argue a similar sentiment with this one. Ultimately, this just hurts the story and the themes. But speaking of hurting the story and the themes, Abby. The problem with Abby's story is it doesn't serve any purpose. Abby's story doesn't reflect Ellie's in any meaningful way, nor does it follow the destruction left in her wake. Abby doesn't reflect on anything she's done. She doesn't grow as a person, nor does she act as a warning for what you can become. Abby's story serves no purpose, narratively or thematically. Okay, so I get it. I get what they were trying to do. They wanted to show us what Abby was doing so that they could empathize her. And the rest of her characters so that, the player would feel a little bad about all the, murder. It's just that this entire section doesn't match the rest of the game. It feels more like a DLC add-on than part of the main story. Okay, so essentially, previously on Abby. Abby's dad rescues a zebra. Abby establishes she would sacrifice herself for a cure. Her dad doesn't. He dead. Joel dead. Abby rescues Kid. Abby attaches to Kid. Kid family dies. Abby adopts Kid. Everything goes to shit. So I feel this area of the game could have been utilized better. Starting with the opening. I don't feel sympathetic for Abby's dad. I'm sorry, but it just genuinely sounds like he's planning to use Ellie as a sacrificial lamb to rectify all the Firefly's previous sins.
All of that is justified with this one act.
Which it won't, because regardless of the infection, the Fireflies made their choices. Now, I'm not going to shortchange Abby's character to that she simply becomes Joel, but there are definitely parallels to that. Abby is portrayed as a morally dubious character who doesn't seem to learn any lessons throughout the story. And that's a problem. Because for me, it's kind of difficult to get behind a character who just refuses to self-actualize. Okay, so the obvious lesson for Abby is the world is grey and people aren't evil. With the time she spends with the kid and how in the end she's even saved by her latest mortal enemy, we can assume that people are just more complicated than they let on. But her character never internalizes that lesson. The kid is played as a little more of an exception than the rule, and she shows contempt towards Ellie after she saves her life. She doesn't actualize what's going on, which is honestly a little annoying. The other half of this is life after revenge, or life after obsession. We follow Abby right after she got her oh so righteous revenge. But to be honest, you wouldn't know. If you started the game here, you wouldn't know what happened. She tortures and murders a man that she obsessed over for years. But there's no reflection on that. There's no reflection on what she's done. There's no reflection on what this obsession has cost her. Or at least in a way where it actually shows her paying that cost. I made the comment that this section feels more like a DLC than part of the main game. What I meant by that is that this section feels extremely disconnected from the rest of the game. A bit like a Meanwhile episode from TV, or a DLC where you follow an alternative character throughout the game. It just never seems to connect to the main story in a meaningful way, which is weird, because it's 10 hours of the game. Also, this is milk. I find the ending honestly to be a bit of a double beat. So Abby and Ellie finally meet up to duke it out. Then they leave to only re-meet up and duke it out. Not a lot happens in the space between. Starting with Abby, she gets kidnapped. We don't see what happens while she's kidnapped. It doesn't progress her story. It more so just keeps her stagnant so that another character can catch up. Ellie, meanwhile, suffers from PTSD and immediately sets off to find and fight Abby. This sequence is solid. It does show that this is something Ellie can't walk away from. But considering she's about to in 5 minutes, it feels contradictory and redundant to her story. Which brings me back to the beginning. What is the theme of this game? Because it can't be revenge and forgiveness. I mean, sure, there's this. But then there's also this. So, if revenge is the theme,
then we've got a massive 10-hour chunk of time that's just kind of unrelated to that concept. A theme needs to tie everything together, and Revenge and Forgiveness simply doesn't do that. Now, we do have an alternative, the cycle of violence, which on the surface makes a lot of sense. Joel hit Abby, so Abby hit Joel, so Ellie hit Abby. Only for this cycle to finally stop when one of them finally decides to stop. Except, it doesn't. Technically, Abby ended that cycle of violence here. So that should have been the end of it, except it's not. She immediately faces extreme violence from another group. And Ellie also kind of hunts her down for that final standoff. But then Ellie stops the cycle of violence herself, only to lose a finger, unable to play guitar, and forever changed. Punishing her like that kind of also contradicts the message. Finally, there's obsession. Abby was obsessed with Joel. Ellie was obsessed with Abby. And then Abby was obsessed with nothing for over 10 hours of the game. Listen, I'm happy to be wrong about this. Comment down below and we can have that conversation. But as of right now, I genuinely don't believe this game has a theme, which is kind of a big deal. Because ultimately, I believe that's why this game doesn't work. A theme ties everything together. And thus this game becomes a collection of ideas just kinda rammed together. I mean, a lot of it works in isolation, but that's the problem. It's not in isolation. It hasn't been sewn together well. Thus a lot of concepts and ideas just kinda contradict each other. Are the Seraphites religious fanatics or just urban terrorists? Are the Fireflies good guys or bad guys? A lot of these concepts work, they just kind of contradict each other. Hitchcock knew what he was doing. He knew how to do it well and how to do it with purpose. But ultimately, The Last of Us Part 2 doesn't have that. And I feel that's why the story fell apart. Editing Jacob here, just doing my outro saying goodbye. Goodbye from the video, I guess. I worked really hard on this one, so I hope you enjoyed it. If you disagree with me, please have that conversation with me in the comments down below. This is an open dialogue and all that stuff. Otherwise, please share, like, and subscribe. It would mean the actual world to me.